The courtroom was already tense, but no one expected what happened next. Pam Bondi had barely finished her sentence when the judge suddenly leaned forward, raised a hand, and cut her off mid-argument. "Counselor, that's enough." The room fell completely silent. Attorneys stopped writing. Reporters looked up from their laptops. Even the gallery seemed to hold its breath, because in that moment, everyone realized something unusual was unfolding inside the courtroom. What started as a routine legal argument had suddenly turned into one of the most talked about moments of the hearing, and it all began with a single interruption. The hearing had started like many others. Lawyers shuffled papers across polished wooden tables. The quiet rustling of legal documents filled the room as clerks carefully arranged folders and checked the case docket one final time. A courtroom deputy stood near the bench, ensuring that everything was in order before the proceedings officially began. Moments later, the door behind the bench opened. "The court is now in session." The judge stepped into the room, and everyone immediately rose to their feet. The atmosphere shifted into the familiar rhythm of courtroom protocol. After a brief pause, the judge took his seat and gestured for everyone to sit. Chairs moved softly across the floor as the attorneys, observers, and reporters settled back into place. At the center of the room sat Pam Bondi, known for her confident courtroom presence and direct legal style. Over the years, she had built a reputation as a sharp and disciplined attorney who rarely stepped into a courtroom unprepared, and today was no exception. Stacks of neatly organized notes rested in front of her. Legal briefs were marked with tabs and highlighted sections, each one carefully placed for quick reference. A legal pad sat beside them, already filled with handwritten points she planned to emphasize during the argument. Her legal team sat close by, quietly reviewing documents and whispering brief reminders as the hearing prepared to begin. Across the room, the opposing attorneys did the same. The issue before the court was far from simple. It involved a complicated legal dispute that had already drawn attention from legal analysts, political commentators, and reporters who followed high-profile cases. Some of them were seated in the gallery that morning, laptops open and ready to record every key moment of the hearing. Both sides understood that the arguments presented today could influence how the case moved forward. The stakes were high. After reviewing several documents and confirming the procedural details of the case, the judge looked up from the bench. Then came the moment attorneys wait for. "Counsel, you may proceed." Bondi stood calmly, adjusting the papers in front of her before beginning. At first, the atmosphere remained calm, measured, professional. Her voice carried clearly across the courtroom. As she began laying out the key points of her argument, step by step, she spoke with the controlled pace of someone used to addressing judges, carefully structuring each point to build on the one before it. She referenced past legal precedents, citing cases that she believed supported her position. Each reference was precise, accompanied by page numbers and sections from prior rulings. Occasionally, the judge glanced down to verify a citation or review a document while Bondi continued speaking. Bondi then shifted to procedural concerns surrounding the case. She explained why certain actions taken earlier in the process raised questions about how the law had been applied. Her argument focused on legal consistency, on fairness in procedure, on whether the standards typically applied in similar cases had truly been followed. Across the room, opposing attorneys listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes or marking sections in their own case files. The courtroom remained quiet, except for Bondi's voice and the faint tapping of reporters' keyboards in the gallery. For several minutes, everything proceeded exactly as a legal hearing usually does. Structured arguments. Explanations. Occasional nods from the bench, but gradually, something subtle began to change. As Bondi continued explaining her position, the emphasis in her argument started to grow stronger. Her tone became slightly more forceful, her points more direct. The careful legal framework she had been building began moving toward a broader interpretation of the issues surrounding the case. Some people in the courtroom began to notice the shift. A few reporters looked up from their screens. One of the opposing attorneys leaned forward slightly in his chair. Even the judge's expression changed just a bit as he listened, because the discussion was no longer just about technical, legal details. It was beginning to move towards something bigger, and that's when the tone of the discussion truly began to shift. As Bondi continued speaking, her argument gradually became more forceful. At first, her tone had been calm and methodical, the way attorneys typically present structured legal arguments in court. But as she moved deeper into her explanation, there was a noticeable shift in her delivery. She leaned slightly forward at the podium, one hand resting near her notes while the other gestured subtly to emphasize key points. Her voice remained steady. But now it carried a stronger sense of urgency. Bondi explained that the issue before the court, in her view, went beyond a single motion or a narrow legal technicality. She acknowledged that the case involved complex procedural questions, but she suggested that something larger was also at stake. Fairness, consistency, and the way legal standards are applied in situations like this. She argued that courts have a responsibility not only to interpret the law, but to ensure that similar cases are treated under the same legal principles. If those principles shift too much from one case to another, she suggested, it can raise difficult questions about how the system operates. Her words were carefully chosen, but the implication was clear. Bondi believed the court should take a closer look at how certain decisions in the case had been handled. At one point, she referenced several past rulings that she believed supported her argument. She cited the cases by name, pointing to specific sections that addressed procedural fairness and judicial discretion. Each reference was delivered with confidence. She turned a page in her notes, then continued outlining why she believed those rulings were relevant to the matter currently before the court. Across the courtroom, the opposing attorneys listened quietly. One of them scribbled a note on a yellow eagle pad. Another leaned toward a colleague, whispering briefly before turning his attention back to the front of the room. Meanwhile, several reporters seated in the gallery continued typing, occasionally glancing up to follow the exchange unfolding. In front of them, Bondi then expanded her argument. Further, she suggested that certain decisions surrounding the case raised broader questions about judicial interpretation and procedural consistency. While she didn't accuse the court of wrongdoing, she made it clear that she believed the legal reasoning behind some earlier steps deserved closer scrutiny. A few people in the courtroom exchanged quiet glances. Statements like that, especially during a federal hearing, tend to draw attention. Attorneys often walk a careful line when discussing the actions of a court. Critiquing legal reasoning is a normal part of advocacy, but doing so too broadly can sometimes shift the tone of a hearing. Still, Bondi continued without hesitation. She flipped to another page in her binder and pointed to another precedent she believed was particularly relevant. According to her interpretation, that ruling suggested the court had the authority to revisit certain aspects of the case, and perhaps, she argued, it should. For a moment, the judge said nothing. He simply listened. His hands were folded calmly on the bench, and his eyes moved slowly between the documents in front of him and the attorney speaking across the courtroom. From the outside, his expression was difficult to read. Occasionally he would glance down at a page, reviewing the citation Bondi had just mentioned. Other times he watched her directly, listening closely as she expanded on her argument. The courtroom remained almost perfectly quiet. The only sounds were Bondi's voice and the soft tapping of keyboards from reporters documenting the exchange. Then Bondi made another point. This one appeared to push the discussion even further. She suggested that if the court allowed the earlier decision to stand without reconsideration, it could set a precedent that might influence similar cases in the future. For a brief moment, her words hung in the air, and that's when the judge finally responded. Bondi had just begun expanding on her argument when the judge suddenly raised his hand. "Counselor." The single word cut through the courtroom with quiet authority. Bondi stopped immediately, her sentence ending mid-thought. For a brief moment, the room seemed frozen. The judge leaned forward slightly over the bench, his expression calm but focused. He adjusted the papers in front of him before speaking again. His voice remained measured, the kind of tone judges often use when they want to redirect a discussion without escalating tension. But the message behind his words was unmistakable. He reminded Bondi that the court's role was not to debate broad political interpretations or speculate about motivations behind earlier decisions. Instead, he explained, the hearing was meant to address a much narrower set of issues, the legal questions directly before the court, nothing beyond that. He emphasized that courtroom arguments must stay grounded in established legal standards, statutory interpretation, and the factual record presented in the case. Speculation or broader commentary, even if well-intended, could move the discussion away from the purpose of the hearing. As he spoke, the room grew incredibly quiet. Reporters who had been typing moments earlier slowed their keyboards. One attorney in the gallery paused mid-pen, hovering above his legal pad. Interruptions during legal arguments aren't unusual. Judges frequently ask questions or request clarification while attorneys are presenting their points, but something about the timing of this interruption made it stand out. Bondi had been building toward a broader conclusion in her argument, suggesting that the court's earlier decisions might have implications beyond the immediate case. The judge's response made it clear he wanted the discussion brought back to a narrower focus. Bondi paused for a moment after the interruption. She glanced briefly at the papers in front of her, as if recalibrating her next words. Then she nodded. The gesture was small, but noticeable, an acknowledgement that she understood the judge's direction. The judge continued speaking for another moment, clarifying his position. He explained that the court's responsibility was to evaluate the arguments based on the applicable law and the specific evidence submitted by both sides. While broader discussions about policy or interpretation can sometimes arise in legal debates, he said, this particular hearing required a more precise focus, legal standards, procedural rules, and the factual record tied directly to the case. Nothing more, nothing less. The clarity of the statement left little room for misunderstanding. Several people seated in the courtroom exchanged quick glances, recognizing that the judge had firmly drawn a boundary around the discussion. Still, his tone remained professional and controlled. There was no sign of frustration or hostility, just a clear effort to keep the hearing moving in a structured direction. After a few seconds, the judge leaned back slightly in his chair. Then he made a small gesture with his hand toward Bondi, a simple signal. She could continue. Bondi straightened her papers before speaking again, taking a brief moment to gather her thoughts. Her posture remained composed, but it was clear she was adjusting the approach of her argument. Moments like this are not uncommon in courtrooms, but they often have a subtle effect on the rhythm of a hearing. The judge had not rejected her argument outright, he had simply redirected it. But even a small interruption from the bench can change the energy in the room. By that point, the dynamic in the courtroom had clearly shifted. Everyone present could feel it. The discussion would continue, but now it would unfold under a much sharper focus. Experienced courtroom attorneys know that moments like this require careful handling. A single interruption from the bench may last only a few seconds, but it can change the direction of an entire hearing. Skilled lawyers understand that when a judge signals a shift in focus, the smartest response is to adapt quickly. Pam Bondi appeared to recognize that. Immediately, she paused briefly and glanced down at the notes spread neatly across the podium in front of her. Her fingers lightly adjusted a page in her binder as she reviewed the next section of her prepared argument. The pause lasted only a moment, but it was enough. When Bondi began speaking again, her tone had noticeably changed. The broader themes she had been discussing, earlier questions about interpretation and wider implications, were no longer the focus. Instead, she redirected the conversation back to the technical legal issues that sat at the center of the case. Statutes, procedural rules, specific precedents. She began walking the judge through the relevant sections of law, one step at a time. Her approach was precise and structured, the way appellate-style arguments are often presented. First, she referenced a particular statute that governed the procedural framework of the case. She explained how the wording of that statute, in her view, supported the argument her team had presented. Then she moved to prior court rulings. Bondi cited earlier decisions that had addressed similar questions, pointing to the sections she believed were most relevant. Each citation was deliberate, accompanied by page numbers and brief summaries of how the precedent applied. The shift in approach was noticeable. Instead of broad interpretations, the discussion now focused tightly on legal mechanics. Across the courtroom, the opposing attorneys listened carefully. One of them flipped through a casebook, checking the precedent Bondi had just mentioned. At the bench, the judge followed along with the documents in front of him. Occasionally he asked a question, not confrontational, just clarifying. At one point he asked Bondi to explain how a specific ruling differed from the circumstances of the current case. Bondi responded directly, outlining the distinctions she believed made the precedent applicable. Another time, the judge asked about the timeline of certain procedural decisions that had taken place earlier in the case. Again, Bondi answered calmly, referring to the official record and explaining the sequence of events. The exchange now had a steady rhythm. Question, answer, citation, explanation. Observers in the courtroom noticed the shift almost immediately. The earlier tension that had filled the room after the interruption began to fade. What replaced it was a more familiar courtroom dynamic, one where legal arguments unfold methodically under the judge's supervision. Reporters seated in the gallery resumed typing steadily, documenting the discussion as it progressed. Every so often, one of them would glance up from a laptop screen to follow the exchange between Bondi and the judge. A few legal analysts seated nearby leaned toward each other, quietly whispering brief comments about the arguments being presented. Still, even as the hearing moved forward, the earlier interruption had clearly left an impression. Moments like that tend to stand out, not because they involve shouting or dramatic confrontation. In fact, most courtroom interruptions are handled with professionalism and calm, but they reveal something important about how the legal process works. Judges guide the conversation. Attorneys advocate for their clients. And sometimes, the balance between those two roles becomes visible in a brief exchange that lasts only a few seconds. Because in a courtroom, every word matters, every argument is carefully weighed, and occasionally, a single momentary interruption, a clarification, a redirection becomes the part of the hearing people remember. Most not for its drama, but for what it reveals about the way justice is carefully managed inside the courtroom. By the time the hearing wrapped up, both sides had presented their arguments in full. The discussion had moved through statutes, prior rulings, and procedural questions that shaped the case. Each attorney had been given time to present their interpretation of the law, while the judge occasionally stepped in with clarifying questions. After the final exchange, the courtroom settled into a brief pause. The judge looked down at the document spread across the bench, reviewing a few final notes before speaking. He thanked the attorneys for their arguments and professionalism during the hearing. Then he explained that the court would take the matter under consideration. A written decision, he said, would come at a later time. With that, the hearing officially came to an end. Chairs shifted quietly as attorneys began gathering their documents. Legal pads were closed. Case files were stacked neatly back into briefcases. In the gallery, reporters saved their notes and shut their laptops. The formal tension of the hearing slowly dissolved as people began filing out of the courtroom. But almost immediately, the conversations that followed focused on one particular moment from earlier in the proceeding. That interruption, in many ways, it had lasted only a few seconds, yet it was the moment everyone seemed to remember. Near the hallway outside the courtroom, several legal observers discussed the exchange quietly among themselves. Some believed the judge had simply been doing what judges often do, keeping the argument tightly focused on the legal questions that actually needed to be resolved. From that perspective, the interruption was less about disagreement and more about maintaining structure within the hearing. Courts operate under strict rules about what arguments are relevant, and judges frequently step in when discussions begin drifting beyond those boundaries. Others saw the moment slightly differently. To them, it highlighted how carefully courts try to separate legal reasoning from broader commentary. Even when attorneys raise questions about interpretation or fairness, judges often work to keep the conversation centered on concrete legal standards and the specific facts of the case. Either way, the brief exchange had clearly stood out. Because in most hearings, arguments follow a predictable rhythm. Lawyers speak, judges listen. Occasionally, a question interrupts the flow, then the process moves forward. It's a structured environment, where each participant understands their role and the rules that guide the discussion. But every so often, something breaks that rhythm, not with shouting, not with dramatic confrontation. Instead, it happens in much quieter ways. A raised hand from the bench, a single word that pauses the conversation. A calm but firm reminder about the purpose of the hearing, and suddenly, everyone in the room is paying closer attention. That was exactly what had happened earlier when the judge interrupted Pam Bondi. In that moment, the courtroom had fallen completely silent. The pause lasted only seconds, yet it shifted the tone of the entire exchange that followed. Moments like that are rarely the longest parts of a hearing. They don't take up pages of legal transcripts, but they often become the parts people remember. Because they reveal something about how the courtroom operates. They show how judges guide the discussion, how attorneys adjust their arguments, and how the legal system maintains structure even during intense debate. On the end, the hearing moved forward just like countless others. Arguments were presented. Questions were asked, and the judge took the matter under advisement. But that brief interruption remained the moment that stood out. A few quiet seconds, a silent courtroom, and a reminder that inside the legal system, even the smallest moments can leave a lasting impression. If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful courtroom moments and political hearing breakdowns. Also, share this video with friends who enjoy behind-the-scenes insights into major legal and political events. And don't forget to drop a comment below. Which moment surprised you the most? Your support helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. Thanks for watching.